Go.
And action!
Just to make me more nervous.
Oh, we have red light.
Yeah, no, that means it's recording.
You're recording.
It's recording our voice. Yeah, but I'm cool, so.
Charles is so beautiful.
Cheers.
Hey.
That's fine, that's fine. No, it's more romantic.
I've done before.
That's fine.
That's part of it. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I hope you'll enjoy it. And actually, I'll just pass on to you. That's chance.
Okay, how y'all doing? I'm Charles Carr. I work at Seahose Aquariums. I've been invited here today to talk a little bit about coral farming and the Save Our Seahorse Foundation, something we're involved with. But I'm gonna try and cover a lot of little bits today, so I'm gonna try. I have a lot of slides and that, so I might rush a little bit, but you can ask anything you want in the questions and all that stuff. But do I have 45 minutes or a half hour with that? Walk freely, okay.
It's a pizza.
Pizza's at 8.
Wait, is that
Pizza's
pizza?
the important
When
one.
do we get?
Okay.
Gee, life is good.
We get pizza.
Do we?
Okay, so this is the company I'm involved with, Seahorse Aquarium. We're the largest aquatic retailer in Ireland. We just opened a new store in Galway. Some of you who have been there already, Ali knows well. We have over 15 full-time staff all over Ireland. We have a seahorse and ornamental fish hatchery. We do custom aquarium work, installation. We build the aquariums ourselves, just about everything really. We also do aquarium management, maintenance for private clients, public aquarium, hospitals, this kind of thing. And then we devote a bit of our time to ornamental aquatic research. And of course we do internships for anyone wanting to get into the field. So it's quite a bit to keep ourselves busy. But anyway, we have a large website, so I could talk about us for quite a long time. So instead I encourage you to go to the website. Check us out. There's thousands of photographs up there of all kinds of bits and pieces of our work and that. So, and you get to know a bit more about seahorses as well. But we'll go back to seahorses later. So why aquariums? What does aquariums have to do with marine biology? Well, conservation. There's a lot we can do with aquariums. I mean, at the end of the day, you're setting up a small ecosystem in a small box. And by viewing, the animals close up, we can really learn about behavior, the reproduction. We can start looking at ways to, how they integrate into the ecosystem. There's so many different facets you can learn by getting the close observation. We just can't do going out into the ocean and diving. It's just the time isn't in it, and you're limited by scuba. So there's only so long you can stay out there. Where in an aquarium you can observe for a very long time. So it's quite good. Now in the aquariums we can also preserve species. I use an example is a fish called the guid from Mexico. They live around Mexico City as well as many other areas of Mexico, but the ones around Mexico City is the most important. Basically their natural habitat is gone. There's none left in the wild whatsoever. So thankfully some of them are alive in aquaria. Some of the public aquariums kept collections together. Many places around the world have them actually, and through this we still have the species. Otherwise, they'd be gone, lost forever. So this is important. Again, the observation, because you can just view the creature close up, the behavior, reproduction, how they behave, interact with each other. And then of course reproduction, propagation, how does the thing breed, how do they spawning behavior, how is the species to select the mate, so forth. And then when we begin to reproduce them, then we can start looking at ways, okay, maybe we can reintroduce them into the wild. Especially something like the seahorse, a small animal that, left to its own devices, breeds very slowly. They have a slow low larval survival rate, that's what I'm looking for. And by having an aquarium, we can basically reproduce them and then reintroduce them into the wild. So it opens many things for the future. So this is an example of another important fish. This is the Bengai cardinalfish. Now this pair itself are actually from the G Hotel. Now this photo was about 2-3 years ago, and now the offspring are still there. So we're second, third generation in the aquarium, which is quite nice. They're from the Bengai Islands in Indonesia. Now it's a very small place. To give you an idea, it's quite a lot smaller in Galway. If you have a look there, it's 5,500 square kilometers. Well, Galway is 6,148. So You can imagine it's quite a small area, and that's the only place they're found in the world. They're a mouth brooder. They breed every 4 to 5 weeks during the spawning season, which can last anywhere from 3 to 6 months, and they only produce 10 to 45 offspring. So you're talking low numbers of reproduction. And again, larval survival rates in the wild are not high for any species, really. They're threatened by collection and habitat damage are the two main problems they're facing. Certain places in the wild, they've already been wiped out. Other places, they've actually become a problem for the ecosystem. They've been introduced into other islands where they're not be found, and they're starting to wipe out native habitat there and native species. So now the good thing is they're easily reproduced in captivity. They can be bred in large numbers without too much hassle. There is a new disease we just discovered with them, but quite interesting. The babies are about 3 to 4 mil, quite large, and they host in the long-spined sea urchin. So in nature, the parent, basically the male carries the babies. He takes the eggs into his mouth brooder. Then after 30 days, he releases them into a long-spined sea urchin, or a Helifungia coral, or possibly Cataphilia. And these are 3 hosts for them. From there, they develop and then, repropagate the local area. They don't migrate. In fact, there's one well-known place where they only exist on one side of the channel, and they've never crossed the channel to go to the other island 100 meters away, because they can't cross that channel. So it's quite interesting. So coral farming, this is the main thing I'm here to talk about. So coral farming is quite an interesting, new development for science. Basically, photosynthetic corals are the main focus we have. Now, non-photosynthetic corals can also be farmed, but much more difficulty. So at the moment, we're still focusing mainly on photosynthetic corals. Now, does anybody know what is a photosynthetic coral? Can anybody tell me? Anybody?
It's a symbiotic relation with algae, so if the algae makes food for it, and in turn the coral provides the algae with water.
That's exactly. So they host zooxanthellae inside the cells. So all these photosynthetic corals have a certain proportion of the food from the algae and a certain proportion from natural feeding on zooplankton. Some don't feed at all and rely purely on absorption and their own zooxanthellae. So basically, because of this, it makes it easier to keep and breed them and to grow the colonies. Now, if we look at the slide here, I can show you a few examples. Before I move on, you can also sexually reproduce them. Certain species are easier than others, but unfortunately we're only starting to begin to learn the triggers as what causes the corals to spawn. So many of them have to reach quite large sizes, and then it's mainly to do with moon cycle. At certain points in the moon cycle, all of a certain species of coral will spawn together. So they use the moon as an indicator. So obviously this makes it a little challenge under artificial conditions, So you can grow a coral both in the ocean and in captive, closed system. So this is an example of a mariculture site. So basically the corals are taken out and laid on metal racks. And then the coral fragments themselves are placed, glued, cemented, or tied onto cement discs. Now there's special cement that doesn't inhibit the coral growth itself, doesn't affect the pH and such. And then they're left anywhere from 3 months to 2 years, depending on what size the colony is at harvest. So this is an example of mariculture. This is another example where coral farming is being used more for habitat restoration. This is the Caribbean staghorn coral. And they've started to die off in many areas of the Caribbean. So now we're taking and farming these in mariculture sites in many places around the Caribbean Sea and reintroducing them, and they've had great success with us over there. These 2 corals, they're both from Galway. This one is in my shop, and so is this one. Both easily farmed, just to give you an idea of stuff you can see locally. And these are both macro shots, so nice close-ups, gives you an idea of the coral colors, Now this is another mariculture site, and it just gives you an idea how they're starting to think more commercially about the coral farming. So here you have a pink coral. You see a nice green staghorn. This is a small brain type, and this is another one of the Acropora staghorn corals. So the main technique we're using is fragmentation. Now fragmentation, as you can see in the photograph, it's literally just that. It's very similar to taking plant cuttings. You pretty much just chop off a piece and you cement it to another, a base, and then allow it time to grow. The best way I put it is the coral, it continuously clones its own polyps and keeps spreading. Another polyp, another polyp, another polyp. And because of this, you can take one big colony and turn it to many small ones. And these are all clones of that big colony, and they continue to grow and grow and grow. So many people ask, well, don't corals grow slow? I always thought corals grow 1 to 2 centimeters a year, I hear. Well, I promise you this is not the case. I'll show you an example now. All right. So here is an example of a reef aquarium. And I'll be able to take you through all the steps here. Underneath the coral, we have what's called living reef base or live rock. So the live rock it's basically dead coral skeleton. This is what used to be coral and a couple thousand years ago, a couple hundred years before. And the new coral would grow on top of this. So here you can see we've taken on the live rock and we've attached small fragments of coral. And now we just need to give them time to grow. So here you can see 0 months. This is 2 months when we added the first coral fragments. Here we have 4 months. You can see them starting to grow. 6 months, growth is much more substantial. 14 months, 20 months, and here we are 2 years later. So you can see the growth can be very, very fast of these photosynthetic corals, especially when additional feeding is used, different supplementation techniques and such, you know. And of course, if you look back to 2 months, you can see it's quite dramatic. So, what is corals using? How are they doing this? Well, and how can we do it in captivity? Well, the coral has to build itself a skeleton. All stony corals make a calcium carbonate compound skeleton, but they also use other elements in the water. And we're only at the beginning of starting to use, to learn some of these other elements that are important, mainly because we're still very behind in technology of water testing. It's very expensive to test for some of the macro and micro elements that it makes it difficult to do research, let's say. So some of the ones that are very, very important straight off the bat, obviously we have calcium. Calcium is one of the main components of the coral skeleton. Then we have magnesium, another main component. Where am I going? We have, I'm trying to find it. Is it hidden there? Nitrogen is very important for the algae inside the coral, as is iodine, somewhere, and iron. Copper is also important, but only in very, very small amounts. Copper can be toxic if it elevates, let's say, what is this, 0.001, so 0.01 is toxic to coral, to give you an idea. So copper is an important one that you need in small quantities. And then CO2 is important that if elevation becomes too high, basically we bring down pH. Have anyone heard of ocean acidification? So what happens with ocean acidification is the elevation of CO2 in the ocean causes the pH to drop. And when the pH goes below a certain level, the calcium carbonate reaction that forms the skeleton can no longer happen. So this basically means the coral can no longer even manufacture its own skeleton. So it's very important, and this is when you hear ocean acidification, this is the main one they're talking about there, is the CO2 and how it increases, you know. Now, all these elements are important in some way to coral. We're only starting to learn more and more, basically, which one is the main ones that stand out. So, again, it's all down to just time and research, you know. So this shows a map of the distribution of all of the photosynthetic coral reefs in the world. Now, does anybody know where else we have coral reefs? Non-photosynthetic. Give you a hint. Well, off the coast of Ireland, we have very, very large, deep water, non-photosynthetic reefs. In fact, we're only starting to discover these occur all over the world. So this shows the distribution of the main areas where you'll find the stony reef corals to make the big reefs we hear about. We think about the Great Barrier Reef, for example. But also in many of these deep areas, we're only starting to learn there's huge coral reefs of very slow-growing, non-photosynthetic varieties. Now we're talking down like 1,000 meters, 500 meters, some of them might start, and as deep as 3 to 5,000, so it's quite substantial. Sorry. Now I'm going to take you on a visit to a coral farm in the United States. I went here about 3 years ago. Sorry. It's quite an interesting place. They had both indoor and outdoor facilities for growing coral, all in captive conditions. In other words, closed system. They didn't have any seawater coming in. They were manufacturing their own sea salt formulations. And then using natural sunlight and artificial sunlight in combination with the supplementation feeding to grow coral. Quite a decent sized company, 8 full-time employees. 40% of the sales were coming solely from what they were growing in-house. In other words, they were not bringing any additional new stock in, no mother colonies and such. They redistribute a small amount of coral from local private coral farmers. In other words, these are hobbyists that have really gotten into it on a whole other level and maybe turned a whole garage into a coral farm. This is happening more and more, but the hobbyist level is starting to come into coral farming, you know. So anyway, these offer an opportunity for these kind of farmers to redistribute their coral around. Like again, I said they had artificial natural sources for growing light, and this is quite interesting when you see how the coloration of the coral is different under both sources, you know. And they've also set up mariculture sites a few places now. Bali is the main one I can think of. They mainly focus on clams there. So again, you'll see some of the clams in the next few slides. So this is the indoor part. So it's quite interesting. These are very, very large vats. They are only 3 filtration systems, and everything is linked. So basically, these 3 systems are then split up into the separate vats. So you get different areas for growing and different light and such. Now you can already start to see all these little fragments of coral. But this is mainly to give you an idea of scale of the facility. And then here you can see the greenhouses outside. So here's outside of the greenhouse. And you notice straight away the color seems quite different coming. We don't see nearly as much phosphorescence. And in general, the color of the coral is much more dull. Here's myself. This is the owner and founder, Dr. Mack. Quite an interesting guy. He originally started off as a vet, an animal vet, and moved into coral farming and marine fields 40 odd years ago. So very interesting fellow to talk to. So anyway, in this part he's just showing us the filtration room, and he's mainly based on ecosystem methods. He just has a lot of live rock. He uses algae turf scrubbing. He uses a giant protein skimmer here, and then he's just supplementing the elements like calcium and strontium, magnesium and such. So here's a few more shots from the greenhouse. This is quite interesting. These are actually mangrove seedlings. So it shows you can even grow trees in these kind of conditions. And then you can just see a whole range of coral in the systems here. This is an open brain, for example. These are the clams I was mentioning earlier. He farms these in Bali and actually Tahiti as well, with local farmers there, and then imports them into the United States. Anyone heard of the giant clams? In case I'm confusing everybody. The giant clams are a very interesting family of clams. Much like coral, they also have photosynthetic algae inside the cells. If you see them close up, they actually have eyes along the mantle, which are not obvious at first because they just appear as part of the coloration. And they get quite large. I mean, some of them well over 1 meter and a couple 100 kilos in the shell, so it's quite amazing. These are mainly Trinidad maxima, which would only get to 8 to 12 inches, so they're one of the smaller ones, but still quite substantial. And now in this area, we can see this is mostly small polyps, stony corals. These are the main reef-building corals we all think about. When you see these, they kind of, you know, when you see your typical National Geographic video and the waves are crashing over the coral reef, that's the kind of zone we would find these corals. Out on the coral reef, where the very outer edge, where the surf meets the first edge of the reef. So they like a lot of energy, a lot of flow, a lot of light. And that's a basic thing about these guys. I'll show you more now. So now we can see inside, you start to bring out all the different kinds of color by manipulating the lighting. So it's quite nice. So you can see here, this is a very phosphorescent piece. For example, this is a, I'm sorry, it was it's my tongue, Wesophilia, I believe. Open brain coral. This is a fungia. You see it's quite orange. And again, these are just demonstrating the phosphorescence that you can see. And here he's got a lot of fragments ready growing on for sale to the next stage. And these are some of the mother colonies. So basically you'd have to grow a mother colony to a certain size and then begin fragmenting it. And then from the fragments you attach to the disc at a smaller size. You wait anywhere from 1 to 3 months on average for a captive grown coral, let's say. And then it's ready for sale once it's encrusted the base and started to form a new colony. Now given time, these can actually be grown into giant colonies. I mean, you could take small frags like this, it's 1 meter in size 10 years later. You can also take frags of the same coral, reattach them together to make a bigger coral, which is very interesting for sexual reproduction techniques where you need large corals quickly. So there's many ways we're learning to manipulate the coral itself, but we're only at the beginning of this. So, you know, it's very interesting stuff. So here's some more of the open brain type corals showing very, very high phosphorescence. I mean, this is nature, you know. This isn't man manipulated. This is completely the natural color found of these corals in the wild. I just, you know, it's kind of amazing, really, you know. And then again, here's these are different types of open brains. I actually have, this is a skull ischemia. I have one of these in Galway, so I encourage you guys all to come down to